Hi, and welcome back to Tech Talk. I'm Ken Mingus, Executive Editor at Computer World. I'm here with PC World's Michael Simon, InfoWorld's Serdar Yelp. I hope I get that right, Serdar. Today we're going to be talking about developers and what they're up to, whether it's a good time to be a developer or a bad time, and ease our way into some mobile information about what's going on after Mobile World Congress. So stick around. Okay, so Serdar, I wanted to start with you because you had this interesting idea that you wanted to talk about in terms of developers and whether it's a good time to be a developer, a bad time, or somewhere in between. So what are you thinking?
Well, a lot of this was triggered by an interview that I read in the Register with IBM Java CTO's John Dumovich. And towards the end of it, he made the statement that the notion that as a developer you'll have to learn Docker and Kubernetes and 30 other things before you can even deploy an app is something I'd like to get rid of. I'm quoting word for word from the piece there. And I thought about that and I said, you know, the amount of conceptual complexity that we have to deal with in this industry on an hourly or daily basis has exploded exponentially in the past, even in the past 5 years, let alone the past 10 or past 20. It's just become that much more difficult to put together something that from the outside would seem like the simplest thing in the world. Like, I want to create a mobile app. How many hoops do I have to jump through to do just that? Or, you know, I just want to put up a website. How many theoretical hoops do I have to jump through to do that? And how many of those theoretical or practical hoops are just inventions of our own, just ways of making this job more needlessly complex than it has to be?
Do you think is it the sort of thing where it's impossible to be a broadly based developer now? You have to really specialize in not only in mobile versus desktop, or Windows, Android, Apple, iOS, mobile. You have to just keep drilling down to the point that it's so nichey that you can't really do anything other than a specific thing that you're doing.
Yeah, I'm reminded a little bit of a joke that I once heard about becoming an academic. When I was in college and people were talking about studying literature, and one of my professors joked, well, nobody studies literature in college. People study Shakespeare. No, they don't study Shakespeare. They study the tragedies. No, they don't study the tragedies. They study the late tragedies. Just every single time it came up, it just got narrower and narrower. And I feel like the same kind of thing is happening here. You can't just be a mobile developer. You have to be a mobile developer for a very specific kind of mobile application. And I agree with that up to a point. I think that it's useful to have a specialization, but I also think that at the end of the day, that's just a starting point. It's good to have that as a job description, but it's not good to let that constrain you, because then you don't learn about all of the other things that are going on. You need to be at least distantly conscious of them. The problem, again, is that because there's so much out there, it's very easy to drown in it. And so a lot of people will retreat into a specialization as a way to not deal with that. There are people who will do nothing but work on one very specific kind of application because everything outside of that is just too intimidating. And that's not good for either them as a developer or for the industry as a whole.
Well, I would also think it would be potentially dangerous in terms of a career, because what happens is if you find your niche, and right now, there is a market for the skills that you have, but then in a couple of years, the ground shifts again, and suddenly you find out you're in a cul-de-sac, and you haven't, broadened your skills enough to be able to maneuver into another area fairly quickly. I mean, that, and then how do you know where that shift is going to take place so you can prepare for it?
One thing that comes most readily to mind is all of the people who spent years learning Flash, only to have Flash become rendered forcibly obsolete.
Right.
There is basically no future in that market. There's a lot of legacy Flash applications, but people are looking for ways to, get away from it entirely and scrap it, or just, convert those applications to something more modern. So all of the work that they did in that vein I wouldn't say that it's been completely destroyed, but it's had a lifespan put on it very abruptly. And that's got to be jarring for people who have tried to, they suddenly realize, no, there are no guarantees in this industry as to the survivability of any one particular skill set.
Well, I mean, but I mean, hasn't it always been that way? I mean, it seems the pace of change so much, especially around technology now, is so fast that I'm not sure of any industry that you can say, other than maybe developers broadly, that you're going to be safe in 5 years, and you can say that with any sense of confidence.
Oh, absolutely. It's always intimidating for people who come in and realize that there's no way to really fully arrive, that you have to constantly keep reassessing yourself, and that unfortunately you're not going to be in a position where you can get comfortable. And there are some people who are just never going to fully accept that. They want to know that there's some place where they can sit down and they can work for 25 years on the same thing and never have to retrain themselves. And I always ask myself, should we feed that misconception? Should we actually build a software, an IT environment where things really can be that stable, or is that just going to be misleading?
Yeah, I'm not even sure that it's possible to build something that stable. I mean, even if you wanted to, and I get the whole idea of having a career path. This is what I do. I do it really well. I've studied everything. I'm staying up to date. And so therefore I'm good for the foreseeable future, 5, 10, 15, 25 years maybe. But I'm not sure I could name a technology right now that will be in place and intact in 25 years or even 10 years.
There are some that you can identify as being survivors. Like, we're still programming in C,
Yep.
even though in many cases we probably shouldn't be. And, there are a lot of people who say, well, there's a good argument to be made that we need to have a foundational set of technologies that should not change, that should have best practices built into them so that we don't constantly have to chase our tails and tear everything down and rebuild them every 5 years.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the way the rest of the world moves, technology is supposed to be serving that world. It's not supposed to be its own little isolated thing. It's not supposed to be, some hermetically sealed environment where nothing ever changes. So it is probably unrealistic to suggest that we can build something that just becomes this sort of perfect, untouchable system that never has to change because it's conceptually complete. You get this a lot when you talk to some developers who come in from the academic side of things, and they have this obsession with the correctness of a particular technology, and they resist the idea that the real world is necessarily messy and incomplete and is constantly in motion. So we need to have a way to give developers a culture that allows them to stay in the loop constantly and not make it exhausting for them. To make them understand that this is the job. The job will always be something you will always be chasing, either your tail or somebody else's, because we're not here to do this just for our own sakes.
Do you think that kind of the rise of mobile, in the sense that more people are using apps, more people know what an app is than ever before. However, they don't expect to really pay much to use those apps. Like, how has that influenced the either new developers or even older developers into saying, all right, there's just the monetization of this industry has completely been put on its head, where we used to charge $100 an app, now we're charging $5 or maybe nothing for similar functionality.
It's very tempting to think that there's some way that we can go back to the old way where we could charge, $250 for something. It's not coming back.
Right.
And a big part of that is because mobile created the way mobile apps worked in general created a set of expectations for people. Yep. Once you set those expectations, it's very hard to take them back. Those expectations are things like it's instant, it's always on, it's easy to understand, it doesn't require any particular technical sophistication. And on the whole, that's a good thing, because it means that you don't have to have any kind of particular degree in understanding what's going on in this machine that's in your pocket or in your palm in order to get good results from it. I know some people who argue the opposite, that because these things have become so simple, it's actually made things worse, because it means that we're no longer inclined to be curious about them. And I didn't agree with that. I said there's always going to be people who are curious about them. That's why they become developers. Mm-hmm. But anyway, back to the main point is that, once you cross that threshold, once you're selling stuff for $5 or once you're giving it away and you're expecting to make all the money back in a completely different venue, that's it. You can't go back.
Yeah,
at least not in this lifetime.
I think you could easily make an analogy to look at what happened to journalism with the arrival of online. Our business, that you had these silos, and the Wall Street Journal, New York Times could charge X amount of dollars for a subscription every year, and they had a limited audience. And suddenly the internet arrived. Everything was free, quote unquote, online. And free doesn't pay the bills. And you're seeing this massive change over the last 15, 20 years in online journalism and print publications, et cetera. And I think the same thing is true for app development, and especially mobile app development. I don't know of anybody that expects to pay more than sometimes 99 cents for their app, or again, maybe it's free. And the amount of effort that goes into that, and then trying to keep it up across multiple platforms that are also changing in real time, makes it a very dicey proposition as a career, I would think, looking at it from the outside.
And there are ways that it can be made simpler, to write once and deploy across multiple platforms. And even that's not guaranteed. There are all of these subtle little things that creep in and make the deployment process more difficult than it really ought to be. But at the end of the day, again, regarding monetization, I really think that for the vast majority of people, there's just no way to get them to pay for this stuff. Once they've had a taste of free, they simply cannot go back, unless they can be given a very good emotional argument as to why they should. If you're talking about a really vertical industry, where there's not the same set of expectations, that's a different story. If you're talking about, say, the medical industry or point of sale or what have you, I think a different set of expectations do apply there. But for the vast, vast majority of people, they want free, they want it right away, and that's going to create this constant set of demands on a developer that's going to be very exhausting for them. And so I think the only way to really make up for that is just to give them tools that allow them to not have to think about the amount of tail chasing that needs to be done in order to keep these people happy. And we still don't have those tools in some ways. We're still trying to figure out how to make that work.
Yeah, I mean, much like journalism, I mean, people don't even look at the amount of man hours that go into such a simple little thing, to write an article, to develop an app. I mean, we're talking about, hours and hours of work, and people just take it, and they expect to take it. And there's, I think the push to a subscription model for people who want a higher set of features, just, much like newspapers, if you want to read more, you get X number of articles for free. If you want to read more, you can pay for it. I think that's probably the smartest way to bring back to some kind of a level of, of understanding or expectation that, we need to pay for these services or else they're not going to be made anymore.
I think another thing that helps is also being blunt with the audience about it. If you go, for instance, to the Guardian's website, at the bottom of every single article they run, they now have a footer that says, "We'd like a moment of your time. If you think quality journalism is worth supporting, please consider a subscription." They don't want to paywall. They don't want to make it mandatory, but they do want you to be conscious every single time you read something that they produce, that this is quality work that demands support. But app development is kind of a different story. People don't see it in the same way that they would see service journalism. They see it as, well, you're the company providing me with it. You wouldn't be in this business if you didn't think it was worth the investment.
Right.
Whereas with journalism, there's a little bit more of an idealism at work.
Yeah.
So, but I do think that the freemium model can also only get you so far, and it really does depend on what audience you're trying to serve. A mainstream audience, you may be able to get enough momentum with a freemium model that you can pay your bills, but that's about it. It's very, very hard to make the kinds of money that you need to support a really big development effort unless you have a separate branded enterprise version that enterprises are going to pay for. And that's a very vertical market again.
Yeah. Or like a pro model or something like that.
Exactly.
That offers a different subset of features.
Yeah, that. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that's almost like an entirely different market. If you've got an enterprise,
it is. Yeah.
I mean that you can charge more. You do have specialized skills and apps and software that you're providing. But when you're looking, so you either go broad and inexpensive and say, please give me money, or you go narrow, deep, and hope that what you're providing to companies is so valuable that they will pay the amount of money that you need to continue to do that. But it doesn't seem like there's anywhere in between. It's sort of an either or.
Yeah.
It's one way or the other.
I don't think there is. I think you're either going to have to do, like you suggested, you're going to have to do something that will appeal to everybody in a very broad and flat way, or you're going to have to appeal to very specific audiences in an extremely deep way and figure out ways to monetize their needs in a way that absolutely nobody else can serve. And again, that's inherently difficult. It's not easy to figure out what people actually want in those narrow little niches. But I don't think we're going to be able to go back to the model where, you could just offer a piece of software for $25 to everybody.
Right.
Okay, well let's circle back to the original question then and see if we can get an answer.
Yeah, sorry.
No. This is exactly the kind of discussion. All right. So with that, as the background where we are, is this a good time, do you think, to be a developer, or is it a troubling time to be a developer, or both?
It's certainly a challenging time.
Okay.
I mean, there's in some ways it's great because you have access to resources and tools and possibilities that were just undreamed of even 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Like the idea that I could take a single, self-contained piece of software and deploy 100 instances of it with a push of a button is really kind of wonderful. But it's not the technical side of it. It's not the infrastructure side of it that I think is really the problem. All of that stuff tends to solve itself over time. The big problem for a developer these days is trying to figure out what people actually need and how to serve that need. And that's not something that comes naturally to the IT mindset. I think they tend to think in terms of, I've got this fantastic solution, and then they can't really think of what problems it actually solves. Last time we were talking about blockchain as being something very much in this vein. It's a solution without a problem.
Yeah.
So the real problem is not even so much, I think, the tool set or the technology stack. It's that developers don't really stop to take the time to think about what problems are worth solving, and that's why it's challenging for them in these times. Is because they're not educating themselves into what problems need to be solved.
I tend to be an optimist, and I think if I were trying to answer that question, I would say I agree. It's a challenging time, and will continue to be a challenging time for developers. But given the now fairly low barrier to entry, to getting started, to being able to dip your toe in and learn, again, especially around mobile apps, if you do have that $1 million idea, your ability to get something built around it and perhaps get it out there is much easier than it would have been 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. The risk there is that you may not be able to monetize it the way you would have. So more opportunity, but higher risk, I guess, is where I'd come down. I'm big, I think cost or barrier to entry, lowering that is a good thing because you have more people experimenting with this stuff.
But it sounds like the downside is that you're, at the end of the day, if you can't monetize it, you're just going to be forced to give it away.
And you've also got a lot more competition.
Yes, because everybody else would also be trying to do exactly the same thing. But then you could just from your own work.
Right.
You just hope that Google or Apple or Amazon buys you for a couple $1 billion.
Yes, or if you can find something that you can host as a service and you provide it as a service, then you don't have as much risk of having it taken away from you. But again, that requires an outlay. Maybe not as much of an outlay as it did before, but it still requires some outlay. It still requires some engineering.
Yeah. All right. So optimistic but dicey, I guess, is the way we'd come down on the to answer the question.
It's never been a better time to start being a developer, but it's a really hard time to continue being one.
Yeah, and successfully so in terms of a career. Okay.